What a nice turnout and what a nice intro. Thank you guys for having me. Thanks to Abby, Meredith, Megan, Patrick, Jerry, everyone at ITR, and Chris and Kay, and everyone at ITR for welcoming me, and Clay and Tim. I'm really excited to be here. So why don't I get on with it, because I want to field your questions and I want you to see a little bit about what I'm up to, okay? So some of you that have seen me give talks before, the first part of my talk is usually pretty similar because I got to bring everyone up to speed. So I kind of reuse those slides. Hopefully at some point, if you've seen me give a talk, it forks and it's something new. If not, I'm sorry. Maybe we can go out to dinner or something, and I do have new things to share. It's been a while since, I think 2 years since I gave a talk here at Minnesota. Okay, I'm really excited. So I'm going to talk to you guys about this area that I've been working in, which is adaptive intervention science. And one tool that I'm an expert in, it's only one tool that I use in this area. It's called the sequentially randomized trial. It's also known as a SMART. And more recently, I've made a pivot I'm starting to make a pivot, like Clay Cook, toward implementation science. So as we get toward the tail end of my talk, you'll see where my latest interests lie, which is in implementation science, and what does this mean, adaptive interventions in implementation science. Hopefully we'll get there, okay? So here we go. All right, I'm part of the D3 lab. It's a cool crew, a fun group of people back at Michigan, and day in, day out, all we do is think about dynamic intervention science. That's all we do, okay? How do you sequence interventions? You're going to see what I'm talking about. So I don't really have 119 slides. Don't worry, okay? I have a lot of backup slides, though. And a lot of my slides are pictures, so don't worry about it, okay? You should have time for questions. So here's roughly what's going to happen. I'm going to introduce what an adaptive intervention is. I'm going to talk about a framework that helps me think. Then I'm going to introduce SMARTs, and this is really the fun part. I'm going to go through these case studies. The way I like to give this talk is, as I'm going through case studies, I'm going to sprinkle in what are some of the innovations that me and my colleagues and me and my students have worked on in this space. So I kind of sprinkle in the methodological interventions and innovations as I'm talking to you about specific examples, because that helps you grab onto it, okay? That's how I'm going to go about it. If I stop the talk here, or here, it doesn't matter where I stop it. It's no problem. So we can have a natural end, even if I don't get through the whole thing and you ask questions. So I would love for you to ask me questions as we go along. It doesn't matter if we only get through slide 20. That's perfectly fine, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. All right. So many of you guys are interventionists, clinicians. And you know that intervention often entails a sequential approach where you adapt and readapt treatment over time. So here's my therapist. Here's my person with depression or anxiety, right, Meredith? And you're going to try something on this person, and after 6 weeks, you might try something else because it's working. I did say that. You might try something else because it's working, because maybe if it's working, you taper down intervention, or you might try something else because it's not working, right? So adaptive interventions, which is what I'm talking about today, is nothing more than a guide for intervening in this way. Not a replacement for the clinician, a guide for intervening in this way. So here it is in words. This is a mouthful. An adaptive intervention is a pre-specified sequence of rules that guide whether, how, or when, and importantly, based on which measures. Meaning, how do we monitor kids on anxiety? How do we monitor kids with depression? To alter an intervention. And when I say an intervention, I have a very broad definition of what I mean by intervention. It could be you're altering the monitoring schedule. It might be that now I'm going to monitor the child instead of once a week, I'm going to monitor them once a month. Or it could be that I'm lowering the dose from 2 sessions per week to 3. I have a very broad sense of what it means to do an intervention component, okay? Okay, so here's an example. I love this example because it's easy to understand. So these are children with autism. It turns out, as you guys know, 50% of children with autism who received interventions beginning at age 2 remain nonverbal at age 9. We no longer use the term nonverbal, by the way. Now we've moved to a term called minimally verbal, children with autism who are minimally verbal. And we also know that if you don't have spoken language by age 5, bad things will happen in the future. That's the setup. There's a number of evidence-based interventions, DTT, which is sort of your ABA, your usual applied behavior analysis. There's some newer ones like Jasper, which focus more on joint attention. They're more play-based. They try to improve spoken language acquisition by creating social creatures. So it's a little different than sort of teaching to the actual words that we're trying to teach the child. And then another promising intervention are these devices. These slides are from maybe 5 years ago, where all the excitement was around like iPads. We can give iPads to children with autism. And all of a sudden, they're magically going to use their words. Well, maybe not. It turns out iPads and are costly. And I don't just mean monetary costs, because I think most parents with children with autism are willing to shell out the $400. It's mostly, what I mean by cost is, if you're using the iPad in the therapy session, you may not be using some other intervention components. And if you have an iPad and you really want to get serious about it, the therapist better be using it the right way. So there's a cost in terms of using it. There's a new intervention that has to take place that's using this tool, this intervention component. This motivated us to think about the role of devices. Anytime you see AAC, just think devices. Devices in the context of these interventions. So here, let me give you an example. This is very simple, but it gets us all on the same page. I start off with a behavioral intervention. This is that joint attention intervention where I'm with the kid twice per week. And after 12 weeks, I discover whether the child is a slow responder or a faster responder. I'm going to define that on the next slide. It's not just willy-nilly. And if the kid is responding, I might continue with that intervention. But if the kid is not responding, I might bring in the device. Okay? So how was response defined in this example? For these guys, it was based on a 25% change or more, based on 7 measures of language acquisition over the course of those 12 weeks, okay? Okay, so, all right, up until this point, I haven't said anything about research. I've just talked about these things called adaptive interventions because I needed to make sure you knew what they were. And they sound much like clinical practice. So, okay, now let's all put on our researcher's hat, right? This is my mad scientist, all right? So, there's 3 directions you can go in your adaptive interventions research. You might be preparing or addressing acceptability and feasibility concerns. I'll explain what that means. You might be learning how best to optimize an adaptive intervention. Do I need the device now? Do I need it later? Are there some kids that I can delay the device for? Or you might be ready to evaluate an adaptive intervention. Each of these types of questions deserve a different research methodology. That's how we view the world. And these 3 stages are what's known as the MOST framework. It's not a method. MOST is not a method. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of knowing what intervention science you're doing. What stage are you in? Are you in the piloting, optimizing, or evaluation? Okay, so what is preparing? What is step 1? These are piloting, observational studies. And later I'm going to show you a pilot sequentially randomized trial. Okay? So this is where you're addressing acceptability, feasibility. Can I monitor a child? Can I monitor an adult who has an alcoholism disorder for their number of heavy drinking days per week? Can I do that? Can I even do that? Can I even get good data by doing that? That could be useful in deciding what to do next. This is building optimizing, which is, do I need the device now or do I need it later? How do I best monitor the person? Now I've already accepted I have feasibility and acceptability, but how do I cobble together the adaptive intervention, all the different pieces of it? And then evaluation. All of you guys are familiar with evaluation because that's what you were taught in your graduate school days, my randomized controlled trial. This is where you might take your adaptive intervention and put it up against usual care, a 2-arm trial, nothing too complicated. So here's an example just to send home that point. That intervention I showed you at the beginning, that adaptive intervention, if you were ready, if you thought that was a good intervention, you might just do a 2-arm study of that intervention. Half the kids get that, and half the kids get some usual care, and you pin them head to head. That's nothing more than a 2-arm study where one of your interventions is an adaptive intervention. That's if you're in the evaluation stage. Everybody see that? Okay, so pilots are in the preparation stage. SMARTs, which I'm going to talk to you about next, are in the optimization stage. Standard RCTs are in the evaluation stage. This is all set up for what I want to talk to you about, which is SMARTs. That's what I want to talk to you guys about. Okay, so what do we mean by optimization? Let me get a little more serious with you guys about what it means to build or optimize. So here's some specific examples, questions in the context of that example AI I gave you earlier. So is it better to provide the device from the start? Because remember the example I gave you earlier only provided the device for kids that were not responding. Remember that? Well, why not give all the kids a device from the get-go? That's a question. That's an optimization question. Another one might be who benefits from the device early versus later. It might be that some children will benefit more if the device is in the clinic session up front versus some children you really ought to wait. Well, who are these kids? Maybe I don't need the device at all. Maybe for kids that are slow responding, I just go from 2 sessions per week to 3 sessions per week, right? Maybe we just don't need the device at all. These are called optimization questions because they're questions about how do you build the best possible dynamic sequence of interventions. Everybody with me? Yeah. In the olden days, and maybe still now, we used to form these interventions based using expert opinion. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. All of you guys are experts. We're all experts. Clinical expertise, extremely valuable. Or maybe even piecing together an adaptive intervention using separate studies. Nothing really wrong with that, but can we do better? Is the question. Can we do better? And the sequential randomized trial is nothing more than a 4th bullet on there to help you do better in building an adaptive intervention. So let me share with you what a SMART is. A SMART is nothing more than a multi-stage randomized trial design. It's actually a type of factorial design. At each stage, subjects are randomized to different intervention options that make sense for that patient, for that student at that stage. Okay? And the cool thing about SMARTs is treatment options at later stages could be restricted by response to earlier treatments. So for example, if I know if a kid is responding, they don't need the device, then I don't need to randomize the responding kids to have the device, right? We can do that in the SMART. It's pretty exciting. They were developed for building a high quality or optimizing an intervention. SMARTs typically, and I'm putting typically here because we don't like to be dogmatic, are not used for evaluation, although there are some exceptions. Yeah? You guys, no questions so far? No questions? You guys, all right, that's because you guys have seen me do this perhaps. Okay, here's what we call prototypical SMART. You randomize folks to intervention A versus B. In this prototypical SMART, if you're responding, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you're not responding, you might consider a switch. So from A, you switch to B, or an augment. You might add A and B. This is sort of a generic way most people come to learn and think about SMARTs. They think like this. The beautiful thing about SMARTs is that they're not all made the same. Okay? And I hope to goodness they don't all look like this. Okay. All right. Now is the fun part. I'm going to get into some case studies where you guys can really see the beauty of these type of trials because you can see the beauty of them in allowing you to answer different questions, okay? So this first study I'm sharing with you is motivated by that running example I started with the autism study. So let me give you a little bit more data on the kids. The kids all were diagnosed with ASD. They were 5 to 8 years old. They were minimally verbal in the sense of having less than 20 words in a 20-minute language sample. Okay? And they've had a history of treatments for over 2 years. These were the kids we were working with. Prior to this study, these kids had never been researched before. It turns out that these kids were almost always excluded from studies prior to the study I'm about to show you. That's changed. This was about 7 years ago or so. This is the study we did. We took these children, which I just described. All of them got the behavioral intervention. That wasn't what we were testing. We were testing whether we need the device or not. Because that was all the rave about 5 to 7 years ago. Okay? And for kids that didn't get the device, for all kids, if they were responders, we continued. We used the if it ain't broke, don't fix it strategy. But for kids that never got the device and were slow responders, we then asked another question. Should we go to 3 sessions per week, from 2 to 3 sessions per week, or should we add the device later? If the children began with a device and they were slow responders, there was no re-randomization because at the time this study was designed, there was basically nothing else to give the kids. All we could think of was to go from 2 sessions to 3 sessions per week. This is an example of a SMART. We're going to learn from this SMART whether we need a device up front or if we can delay the provision of it for slow responders or whether we need it at all. You guys see that? It's pretty cool. So, over the past 3 years, and maybe you haven't seen, maybe this is where the slides start to differ a little bit from if you've seen me give a talk before. Over the past 3 years, I spent a good portion of my time trying to come up with how do you do longitudinal modeling in the context of a SMART. So it turns out you can't just turn the crank and typically use your over-the-counter linear mixed models. to analyze data from a SMART, you can run into trouble. So we've been spending a good deal of time. I've had an R1 from NIDA to be able to chip away at this. And we've made some good progress. So I want to show you what I mean by that. So it turns out that in this SMART, there's 3 adaptive interventions that are embedded within it. One of them was the adaptive intervention that never provided a device. The kid was a slow responder. We intensified if they were a responder and continued. Let me repeat and remind you, an adaptive intervention tells you what to do for all kids, both responders and non-responders. Are we on the same page? It's a strategy for everyone, okay? Also embedded in the study was the adaptive intervention that provided the device later. And also in the study was the adaptive intervention that provided the device early. So there's really only 3 adaptive interventions in this SMART. Okay? And here's my shorthand for them. JAST, JAST plus. JAST, do the device later, do the device up front. Everybody with me? Okay. So a common primary aim in SMARTs, so if you're designing one of these, one of your primary aims might be, well, I want to compare these 3 adaptive interventions on a time-varying outcome. Right? That's a thing you might want to ask. Or I might want to compare 2 of the adaptive interventions that began with 2 different treatments on a time-varying outcome, and you might want to test that. This is where we had to do some statistics, and you couldn't just use over-the-counter, run-of-the-mill methods, right? We had to rethink our modeling considerations. That is, the intermixing of the repeated measures and the fact that kids are changing treatments over time. We had to get thoughtful about that. We had to rethink our effect interpretation. We can't really think slopes, changes in slope anymore, because some of the kids are the same kids and then they fork. So it may not make sense to think in terms of slopes. We have to rethink our effect interpretation. And then we actually had to rethink altogether how we even do random effects or how we might model the within-person correlation so as not to run into trouble. And that's the kind of work we've been doing. So rather than go into the details of the methods, I do have those backup slides. I'm happy to talk about them. I'm just going to show you some results with the methods we developed. So the outcomes in this study were collected at baseline 12, 24, and 36. The primary outcome was the total number of utterances in a 20-minute language sample. So they would take the child, and they would put the child with another human, an adult human that they were comfortable with. This is outside of treatment. Okay? They would measure 20 minutes worth of the conversation, and then a blinded human who doesn't know what treatments the child got would count the number of spontaneous utterances in those 20 minutes. Right? If that's high, it's good. And here's one of the results using the method we came up with. So on the y-axis, you have your spontaneous utterances. The black line is the adaptive intervention that started off with the device out of the gates. The red line is the adaptive intervention that provided the device later, and the blue line is the adaptive intervention that never provided the device. Now remember, each one of these curves are kids that are either responders or non-responders. These curves represent the average outcome under a whole strategy, right? There's responders and non-responders in this curve, and there's responders and non-responders in each of these curves. Everybody with me? Yeah? And why do you think that the red and the blue are the same up to week 12? Right? Because 2 of the interventions don't differ until week 12. This is why we couldn't think of like change in slopes or differences in slopes. And what we learned from this study, it's pretty obvious that providing the device from the gate, out of the gates, led to a whopping increase in spontaneous communicative utterances over the other 2 adaptive interventions. So this difference wasn't so significant, but it was really useful to provide the device out of the gates. Everybody with me? Pretty cool. And we were able to use the new methods I came up with and my students came up with to analyze this data. Okay, we also in our lab, we also do, so we do the full range of methods. We do design, we do analysis, and so when we're doing design, we have to then ask, well, how do we do the sample size for such a study, right? So that's the kind of research I do as well. So in a prototypical SMART like this one, I do the mathematics that helps generate sample size formula. So for example, the sample size formula for an analysis like the one I just showed you is nothing more than the standard sample size formula for a repeated measures design. All right, ignore the red for a moment. The black is the standard sample size formula for a longitudinal study. Rho is my within-person correlation. So what do we know from longitudinal analyses? If I have a really high within-person correlation, rho being close to 1, and I take advantage of that, I need less sample, right? Because if rho is close to 1, this is a small number, a fraction, it knocks down the n, right? But if I have no within-person correlation, if this is 0, then n is relatively higher, right? Everybody with me? Well, the sample size formula for SMART magically happens to be the same one with an extra term, 2 minus r, where r represents the rate of responders. So let's study that for a moment, right? If I had, let's all pretend I had no responders. You ready? Let's all pretend that in this study, I had no responders, 0. Everybody was a non-responder. What would happen? We would essentially have just 4 groups. 4 groups, right? Well, that's why we would essentially be doubling the standard sample size formula, because we'd be going from a 2-arm randomized trial to a 4-arm randomized trial. Yeah? Let's go in the opposite direction. Suppose everyone in the study was a responder. Let's pretend. Hope to goodness that never happens to you if you design a study like this. You're in trouble. You were in trouble from the get-go, right? Because your reviewers shouldn't have given you the money if you didn't have a good estimate for non-response. But anyway, let's pretend that happened. So everyone was a responder. Then let me ask you guys something. Did I have a second randomization if everyone was a responder? No, I had 1 randomization. So this is a 1. Because if everyone was a responder, there's a 1. So I fall back to my 2-arm sample size calculation. Isn't that beautiful, the way the math works out? So the SMART is essentially somewhere in the middle between the 4-arm trial and the 2-arm trial. Isn't that beautiful? It's so beautiful. It's such a, maybe only statisticians geek out on that. It's just beautiful the way the math works out. Anyway, and so this is what we call a SMART inflation factor, because there's no free lunch. You do have to bump up your sample size relative to a 2-arm study. You have to pay a price somewhere, and it depends on your response rate. Isn't that beautiful? It's totally beautiful. All right. Anyway, I just want to be able to show you guys the type of research I do. This is the kind of stuff my lab do. I like to put in red my students, Nick, Brooke, Tim, and this is the type of research we do. And we try to publish this kind of work in both clinical journals as well as statistical journals. I'm kind of like a jack of all trades in that sense, you know? Okay, are we doing good so far? No questions? Yeah? You guys are good? All right, let's go to two more case studies so I can keep showing you a little bit about what I've been up to. This study is by far the study I'm the most proud of that I've ever designed, okay? And it turned out to be a complete mess. in a good way, okay? In a good way. So let's talk about it. Okay, isn't that awesome? Okay, so let's talk about it. So this is also in autism. These are, and now I'm going more towards school-based intervention, okay? So, which I think this audience appreciates. So these are also kids with ASD, but these weren't children who were minimally verbal. These were all school children. Think of an all school children at a school with autism, okay? Ages 5 to 12, right? So I'm basically at an elementary school, and I think middle school as well, right? And then these were inclusive schools in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And the whole goal was to improve social skills. And what I discovered, I'm a statistician, so I need to learn from my behavioral intervention scientists these words. So what Connie taught me was that early on in the research phase, like think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, social skills interventions were rarely studied in the child's natural environment, which befuddled me when she told me that. I'm like, really? They would do social skills interventions in the clinic? That doesn't make sense. So it turned out those interventions had no generalization to the real world. Others that were in the child's natural environment, such as one-on-one pairing with the autistic child with an aide in school, completely backfired. What do y'all think that those interventions backfired? Anybody? Because what are you doing to the child with autism? You're pulling them out of their social environment. So, okay, this is the setup. So my colleague, Connie Kazara at UCLA, she's the one I learned all this from. She said, well, look, we need to fix all this, and there's a bunch of evidence-based interventions now that we do know that work. There's school-level interventions about how you structure the playground. There's classroom-level interventions that are designed to aid the teacher and not burden them, to help them with children in their classrooms who might have autism. There's also parent-assisted social skills and peer-mediated social skills interventions. The peer-mediated one is interesting. You get your child with autism, and you find 4 peers, and you have the peers intervene on the child. Pretty cool. Parent is where you're intervening on the parent, teaching them how to do play dates with other families with autism, right? Totally cool. These work, but there's no guidelines to help guide how do you decide among these interventions and how do you cobble them together in a school environment? Okay? No guidance on that. That's where adaptive interventions come in, because we can't do all these interventions for all kids at the school. It's just not going to happen, right? There's no resources for that. So, one question we had, and we also felt that if the kid wasn't responding academically or socially, we would just combine peer and parent at the individual level. We felt pretty strongly that we would do that. But what we didn't know is, should we start with peer or should we start with parent? Should you begin intervention at the kid level through the parents, or should you begin through their peers? Okay? So that led to this study. Okay? So I randomized to begin with peer or begin with parents. If the kid was a slow responder at week 20 happened to be after the holiday break. Okay, so you basically had a whole first half a year school on peer or parent. If the kid was not responding, I combine. If the kid's responding, I continue. And I was going to look at social connectedness as my primary outcome. Okay? All right, let me ask you guys a question. Is this a sequentially randomized trial? No. It's a 2-arm trial. One arm is box A plus B, this adaptive intervention, and the second one is this adaptive intervention. This would have been a perfectly good study. But my mad scientist friend, Connie, had some other questions. I'm walking you guys through, like, what does the methodologist do? You know what I mean? Because I think it's beautiful what I do, right? But I'm walking you through, like, that conversation. Of course, it's all stylized for you right now because it's messier when you make the sausage, right? But, like, I'm walking you through. Okay, so here's what happened. I got to talking with Connie. She's like, Danny, wait a minute. What about classroom supports? This is a classroom level intervention. And what she really wanted to know is do all classrooms in the Los Angeles Unified School District or at a school need classroom supports? Because some teachers don't need that level of support. They might actually feel overburdened by the classroom supports intervention, which is teaching them how to structure their day to help the child with autism, how to structure the play in the classroom, how to do the scheduling. Some teachers may not need that. And she also wanted to know, is there a synergistic effect between the classroom supports and the individual level interventions? Because it could be that if you're doing the classroom supports intervention and the environment is ripe, then maybe doing peer as the individual level intervention will have a bigger payoff, because the environmental structure of the kid is just right to have their peers intervene with them, right? So she wanted to understand these questions. And I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, because this is what we came up with, which is extremely complicated, and it was. All right, and so what we did is, every kid at the school got the Remaking Recess playground intervention. That wasn't being examined. What we randomized were classrooms to getting classroom supports or not. And sometime later at week 8, we re-randomized to whether you start individual level intervention with peer versus parent. Notice how complicated this study is. Notice this study has randomizations at a classroom level and then randomizations at a kid level. Complicated for someone like me, because how do you analyze this? What are the methods for this? I'm going to get back to that later. It turns out there are no methods for this. No, I'm not just joking. No, really. I'm pretty serious. So, but I was okay with submitting this grant, which we got. We got this funded by IES, because in fact the primary aim of the grant wasn't to analyze the data. The primary aim is to do a pilot study of this complete insanity. Right? And so the primary aim was, in fact, to see what could go wrong. And we basically listed all the things we thought that could go wrong, and then to inform how we would change the interventions or the study when we go do the real full-scale trial. Everybody with me? That's how I view pilots. Pilots are just for seeing what goes wrong, acceptability and feasibility. So when I write an R34, that's what it's all about. Okay, so we wanted to know. Okay, get a load of this. I didn't tell you guys this. The response, non-response measurement here, we wanted to make this as real world as possible, Clay. So we had the paraprofessional at the school who was running the Remaking Recess intervention on the playground be the person deciding which kid was a responder, non-responder. Because remember, when I lose my job as a researcher and these interventions have to live in the real world, it's not me, the researcher, that's going to be doing the response, non-response assessment. That's part of the intervention. So we wanted to make this real world, and we said Oh, let's make it so that the paraprofessional, what a brilliant idea. The paraprofessional doing the playground monitors the kid over time, and based on a measurement-based care, they decide whether the kid is a responder or non-responder. Isn't that wild? Totally wild. Okay, so of course, a lot can go wrong, right? Can we really get the paraprofessional to identify children as responders and non-responders? Can we really transition children at week 8 to individual level intervention? I mean, all the things you can imagine that can go wrong, right? The teacher-rated measures of progress during classroom supports, can we really get those? So our initial thoughts were that maybe we can get teacher-rated supports of satisfaction to classroom supports, and that could help us determine what treatments kids could get. We had these wild ideas. So that's what I view a pilot to be, is what can go wrong. And we are very open, and we air our laundry out for the reviewer, and we say, here it is. Give us money so we can see if this goes wrong. And then in the grant we lay out, if it does go wrong, this is what we're going to try. Okay. So I've written papers about pilot studies. All right. I'm about halfway through my talk, and now I'm getting to part of the talk that's getting me really excited lately. And it's this idea of a clustered SMART study. Okay, so let me share with you one of now 4 studies I've designed in this space. I'm really excited about it. Actually, the one I just showed you was a cluster randomized study because we randomized classrooms, but it wasn't a real one, it was a pilot. It was real, but it wasn't like, I didn't have to know how to analyze the data. I'm going to show you one where I actually do know how to analyze the data. Okay, so a lot of you guys in this room are now pivoting towards implementation sciences and science, as am I. It turns out in the state of Michigan, every high school in the state of Michigan has 1 to 3 school professionals who deliver mental health practices to their kids with anxiety or depression, or are supposed to be there as support. Everybody with me? That's the setup. It also turns out that almost none of these school professionals do evidence-based practices. So whatever they're doing to their child with anxiety or depression is not evidence-based. So this whole study was asking, how in the world can I get cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most studied evidence-based practices, into school settings? That's what this study's trying to do. Everybody with me? So it's an implementation study. It's how do we get the schools to adopt the practice? Okay, everybody with me? And so the interventions I'm going to be talking about here are not interventions on kids. The interventions on kids is the CBT that the school professional is giving them. That's not what I'm studying. That's hopefully going to happen. The interventions I'm talking about here is what do I do at the school level to get the school professional to do that? Everybody with me? Isn't that cool? Totally cool. So what we're doing in this study, which is wild, is we got over 100 schools. Again, each school has anywhere between 1 to 3 school professionals. So let's just say 200 school professionals on average, let's just say. And we're randomizing whole schools to whether or not they get rep versus rep plus coaching. Rep, think of rep as like an in-person training that you do before school starts with some external support, like a phone bank that the school professional can call if they run into trouble with. So you're showing up at the school, you're training all the school professionals, and you're saying, call me if you got trouble. Okay? Everyone gets that, because we think of that as a low-level intervention, right, Clay? We think of that as basic, bare bones. We're going to do that for everyone. What we're testing here is whether we need the coaching. Coaching is skills-based. So I send the coach to drive out to the school. They watch the school professional do a therapy session. They give him feedback. Okay? Now the school district is spending mega dollars, right? Everybody with me? Because the school district is sending a coach to that school, right? That's expensive, so we want to test to see if it really is needed. Everybody with me? If after some time, and it's not really at month 4, we change the design, it's quite a bit later. If the school is suboptimally responding, and I have the definition down here, although it's getting cut off. Where is it? Right here. Oh, greater than 1 school professional has delivered less than 3 CBT components to less than 10 students. Just think of it as an extremely low bar. If that school professional is not doing this, they're pretty much not doing any CBT, okay? I mean, it's a super low bar. That's what we call suboptimally responding. If you were a suboptimally responding school, notice it's an aggregate of all the school professionals at the school, right? At least 1 school professional not doing this stuff. We re-randomize the whole school to add this facilitation component. I think whereas coaching is a skills-based intervention, Facilitation, I think of it more as a business level intervention. I can get away with this because I'm a statistician. It's more about the barriers at the school, like that the organizational barriers at the school that the school professional is encountering that are not letting him or her do their business. Everybody with me? Okay? And our logic for that not happening earlier, because trust me, I'm not showing you how the sausage was made here, but there has to be a rhyme or reason as to why facilitation came later and not earlier, was that when we got down to it, we felt like it wouldn't even make sense to do facilitation until the school professional has attempted to do CBT and encountered barriers. Because otherwise, how would we know what to facilitate? So that's the rationale for why it's what we call a second stage intervention as opposed to a first stage. Whereas we think of coaching as something we can do right out of the gates. Everybody with me? That's the rationale for this. Why is this cool? Because we're sequentially randomizing whole schools. That's wild. That's totally wild. And the outcome is at the level of the school professional. This has never been done before. Okay? It's totally cool. Yeah, I'll take some questions. Yeah, we could stop here. Yeah.
No, we don't have to stop. So one of the things, so it makes sense to me that you would do facilitation later, both because you may well just also be able to capitalize on the fact that some schools just have the systems in place, right?
Yes.
So you don't have to waste resources.
Yes.
But on the other hand, did you and your colleagues think about the ones that are successful, the ones that are responding?
Uh-huh.
I mean, that could be because you've got school professionals who are just Herculean in their effort, right? They are working twice as hard because they're so committed and think this is such a great thing, and it's killing them. You know what I mean? In other words, burning them out.
Yeah.
And so did you think about also adding facilitation as a randomization up on the responding schools, right? So in other words, the responding schools may be working because you're a great school professional and you're making it work, but this is not sustainable. And if I could actually come in with some system level work, you would benefit from it too.
That's great. I love it. Wow. So your question is really cool, and because it turns out, as I understand it, this whole area of implementation science, which still feels like the Wild West, but it's getting better, they are just now talking about sustainment. And I am looking at Clay. They're just now, for the first time, I think at the last big D&I meeting, it's all the buzz is how do we sustain interventions. All the fuss right now has been how do we even get these places to adopt. I'm totally with you. Sustainment out here is major. Just as you can get a person to lose weight fast, but then not be able to sustain that weight loss, you need maintenance interventions. We're going to need sustainment or maintenance interventions in the implementation science world. We didn't explore that here. They felt facilitation wasn't a sustainment intervention. They really felt it was a fixer. But you should know, and I love that you're asking this question, we just submitted for this round, this deadline that just passed, a sustainment intervention we're going to try to tack on to the end of this. Cross our fingers, okay? So that we can try to tackle some of those questions. But you're totally right. Sustainment is major here. Right now, all the fuss is how do we get them to adopt? But already people around the country are talking about sustainment. It's a hot area. Does that help a little bit? But yeah, these guys didn't think of facilitation as something that was for sustaining. They thought of it as something that was for fixing broken barriers. Yeah. Yeah.
You had mentioned that you had slightly changed the design a little bit in terms of when to have.
Yes, we did.
I'm sure there's a lot of different variables that go into deciding when to measure response, how to measure response, and things and how often to measure.
Yes.
I guess I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about what went into that decision.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. So this is the question I get every time. Is how did you decide who's suboptimally responding versus responding? The first answer is we have to iron out pragmatics first. Can we even feasibly get, does it even make sense at month 4 to assess this? And the answer was no in this case. It turns out we completely redesigned the whole thing so that the training begins in January, because forget about it. In the fall, if you're going into a school to do something, it's just not going to happen. So now this cut point is so if I start in January, this is when I come back in the next fall, okay? Or right before summer recess. It's somewhere in there. I can't remember right now. How do we decide on the actual cutoff? We try to look at prior data. And so we did have prior data lying around because we weren't going into this cold. We had a relationship with many of these schools, not with 100 of them, but with a smaller subset. And we looked to see what cutoffs were most predictive of impending doom in terms of not being able to ever adopt the intervention, using other practices such as REP that we had tried on those other schools before. So I don't have time to go into it today, but there is some science and art to how do you come up with what we call an embedded tailoring variable. Ultimately, however, in a study such as this, the definition of suboptimal versus responding, in some ways, those words are misnomers. What it really means in a study like this, it means as following. You ready? Schools identified as suboptimal, as responding, ought never be considered for facilitation. It's really what it means. It doesn't actually mean that they're suboptimally responding. It means that you've decided on a cutoff for a school that you ought not consider facilitation. You're right. A lot goes into that conversation. I don't know if that helps a little bit. Okay. All right. How am I doing on time? I'm doing pretty good. Okay, yeah, I'm doing good. So, again, we do design, we do analysis, we do sample size formulas, right? So, it turns out, magically, the math works out here too, David, that the standard sample size formula for a 2-arm cluster randomized trial with the smart inflation factor, just like in the other one. It's remarkable that the math is working out so cleanly. But these are the kind of papers we write, and it turns out, and so these are some of the papers we write. My student Tim got that published. It turns out that is the only, and this is what I'm going to get to in my future work slide, this is the only paper on cluster randomized smart in the whole of statistics. So you can imagine what my future work slide is going to be about. I'm super excited about it. Okay, I have 15 minutes left. I want to talk about myths or misconceptions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I cherry-picked 3 of them that I think are pretty cool in red. So I'm not going to go through them, but you can read my slides later. One of them is that tailoring variables cannot differ based on previous intervention. Because in all the examples I gave you, it almost looked like the tailoring variable was the same regardless of what intervention I got. But that's a falsehood. It only looks that way in the examples I gave you. There's no requirement that it has to be that way. There really isn't. So for example, here's another study I designed in autism. This is discrete trials training. It's like ABA principles. This is that naturalistic intervention. Because these 2 interventions have completely theoretical mechanisms, it could totally be the case that this definition of response, slow response, and this one are completely different. And that would be an okay thing. Okay? That would be totally okay to do that. There's no rules requiring you. Why? Because this is not a research assessment. You would never do that if it was a research assessment. You always want the same measuring stick across interventions if it was research. But you can do it if we're thinking of it as a monitoring component. Does that make sense? So that's one pretty cool. That should be blowing your mind away. Like when I realized this, I felt all this freedom all of a sudden. I'm like, wow. As a scientist, I'm like, oh wow. It's so cool. Okay, here's another one. Smarts never include a control group because all the examples I showed you don't have control groups, but that's a falsehood. Smarts can have a control group. Let me give you an example with that same study, the same study I just showed you. It turns out that if you look carefully, there are some kids in this trial that no matter what, they're always going to get DTT. Watch. Half of them get DTT. If you're a responder, half get DTT. And if you're a slow responder, half get DTT. That means that kids in boxes B and C, regardless of their response status, will always get DTT all the way through. It's almost as if they were in their own DTT only arm. Right? Well, it turns out that in this example, DTT is usual care. Well, close to it. Because discrete trials training is probably one of the more commonly delivered interventions for children with autism. So embedded in a trial like this, there is a control arm. And then we're trying to figure out if there's better things than that. You guys see that? It's kind of cool. Totally cool. All right, here's another myth or misconception. This is a new one. So you guys for sure have never seen this one. Even if you've never seen me give this talk before, because I just put this one in last night. All right. All aspects of an embedded adaptive intervention must be randomized. Okay, I'm so excited to give this. This is my first time giving this one. All right, so check this out. This is a friend of mine, Greg Roberts. I'm not throwing him under the bus, but I'm going to use this study to share a cool idea, okay? He's my friend at UT. You might all know him if you work in education circles. famous guy, Greg Roberts, Nathan Clemens at UT Austin, at the Meadows Institute. He designed the study and got it funded, okay? IES just funded him. He's throwing a party. I did not design the study. I want you guys to know, okay? It's a good study. I just did not design it. Everybody with me? You guys following me here? All right. I was called in after it was funded as a consultant, okay? All right. So take a look at what's going on here. He's randomizing these kids, reading literacy, okay? To academic intervention, reading literacy, academic intervention, plus self-reg versus no self-reg. And if the kid's doing well, do I go back to core instruction? That means you kind of go back into, you're no longer doing the special thing. Or do I continue doing, or do I go back into core instruction with self-reg? You guys following me? But if the kid's not doing well, do I do even more individualized special stuff to get them to learn literacy? Or do I do more individualized stuff to get them to learn to read plus self-reg? All right, now stare at that for a moment. Okay, stare at that for a moment. This is a SMART. There's multiple randomizations, right? You guys are all with me? Yeah? It's a good study. There's nothing, I actually really like the study. But I want to bring your attention to one of the embedded adaptive interventions in this study. It's encircled. Start with academic intervention. If you're doing well, go back to core. Go back to Gen Pop. If you're not doing well, do individualized academic intervention. Okay? This is the embedded adaptive intervention in the study that doesn't have a self-regulation component. Are we all on the same page? Okay. It turns out, y'all, everyone in this study follows this intervention. Everyone gets it. Every kid in this study is exposed to this academic adaptive intervention. All kids. That's not being tested here. What's being tested is the role of self-regulation in the context of this adaptive intervention. Let me show it to you differently. This study that you're seeing there is identical to this study. All kids get an academic adaptive intervention. And this is complicated. It has the adequate, inadequate, okay, core instruction, step down, step up. But what's really being tested in this study is, do I need self-reg or not? And do I need self-reg or not? You guys with me? Okay. What does this teach us? Why am I geeking out on this? Why is this powerful insight? All right? What do y'all think? I'm posing y'all. Why do y'all think Danny thinks this is powerful insight? This is his study. I'm just showing it to the world totally differently. Why is this powerful insight? Why do y'all think I think this is cool? I think this is cool because I was able to disentangle the interventions that all kids are getting from the research question. And I think that provides clarity. Okay, and that might be good for a reviewer, right? And to describe the study to the world. But that can't be the only reason I think it's cool. The other reason I think it's cool is because once you get this clarity, you realize it might open my mind up to new ideas I didn't think of. It might be that the self-regulation component is on a different schedule altogether than where I'm making treatment decisions for the academic intervention. In other words, why am I tying myself down to the monitoring schedule that's about reading literacy and mapping that on in lockstep to the monitoring schedule for self-reg? Maybe I didn't have to do that. Maybe the notion of when I provide self-reg and how long I provide it for ought to be on a different time scale. But it's only until I disentangle this that I realize that I could do that, right? That the academic adaptive intervention might have its tailoring variable lockstep at week 10, but that the self-regulation component could be at different points in time, or maybe even trigger-based. Do you guys see that? It opens your brain up to like really digging deep on the question. You see that? So I actually think that this not only provides clarity, this might help our science. Okay, so that's my, this is what I'm now calling, I haven't written the paper yet, a seemingly restricted SMART. Why do I say that? Because this SMART, when you stare at this SMART, it looks like I'm restricting randomizations depending on your status, but I'm not. It only seems that way. In fact, all children are randomized and all children are re-randomized, regardless. There's no tailoring variables. It's not embedded. There's no, you see me? You see why I'm calling it a seemingly restricted smart? It's an unrestricted smart. Isn't that cool? I think it's really cool. I'm geeking out on it, okay? This is nothing more than a 2x2 factorial design. It just happens to be sequential. I have 4 groups. No self-reg, self-reg now, self-reg later, self-reg always. Isn't that cool? Totally cool. Okay, what did you learn today? And I have 7 minutes. Okay, so here's what you learned today. You learned about adaptive interventions. You learned about piloting and optimizing and the distinction. You learned about, I sprinkled in 5 different SMART studies and sprinkled in the kind of methods and stats work I do. You learned about sample size. And you learned about 3 common misconceptions about SMARTs. Yeah, David.
Yeah, so, just to sort of frame this, we had our PhD recruiting event in our department. And so, I'm talking to these inspiring 22-year-olds.
Yeah.
They're asking me about, how long do these clinical trials take? And so you start doing the math, on the back of your envelope. You're like, well, it'll take a year or 2 to get funded. It might be a 5-year grant. You might go into a no-cost extension. It might be a few months later that the paper comes out. You're like, it's like 8 years. And,
I know.
They're like, that's a third of my life.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And they're just horrified.
Totally.
So, as we think about sort of the most framework, I mean, what are your thoughts on, how do we speed that up? Because if you spend 8 years just on, one SMART and one optimization,
I know.
that's a lot of time.
That's a lot of time.
And your toolbox could change in those 8 years.
It could change. I'm totally with you. I don't have a good answer to that. I really don't. I mean, I think some of these studies just take a long time to recruit, right? So, you're totally right. Like, some of my autism studies, the 5 years of funding were up, and we had just gotten the last kid through the door. I don't know how to speed that up. I think in the medical world, there's people working on pragmatic clinical trials as a way to speed this up. I'm a little unclear at this time whether SMARTs can plug into the pragmatic world, but I'm thinking about this a lot. In fact, I'm getting invited to some NIH collaboratory in May. It's like the NIH Collaboratory for Pragmatic Trials where they're asking me to talk about this stuff. So I think there's some conversations that might lead to that. I don't have a good answer for this. It would be super cool if there were some simple ways to do this faster. I gotta say one thing about this though. Education scientists, which a lot of you guys are, they usually have a captive audience, Dave. So usually when I talk to ed scientists, they, like you and I in the medical world, we have rolling admissions and rolling randomizations because I can only recruit 2 autistic kids per month, right? But in the education world, they often do their randomization, boom, out of the gates, everyone's randomized. So I actually think in the education scientists, there might be a way to speed this up. And education science budgets are bigger at IES. It could be that in a $3 million grant, as opposed to $1.5 million NIH R01, you could fit in a screening study and an evaluation study, or a SMART, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to be a naysayer. I think it's possible, but I don't know the answer. Does that help? Those are my views. Those are my views on that topic.
Okay. Oh.
Yes.
It's sort of similar to what you're just talking about. Have you considered, or are you aware of others who've considered, interim analysis monitoring?
Yeah.
Sort of akin to what's done in the 2-arm trial, just in a sense that would speed it up if things aren't going well or going really well.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is what I know as something called adaptive design. Adaptive design is not what I've talked about today. That's confusing. The term adaptive design is where the experimental design itself has been adapted halfway through. So for example, the classic example I give people, you have a cancer study, oncology. One of the medications you discover halfway through the study is toxic, and you want to drop that arm. This is one example of what you're talking about. There is recent work in this area in terms of marrying SMARTs with adaptive design ideas. So what I can say to that is, it's coming. It's coming to a store near you.
Good.
Okay?
Danny, thank you so much.
All right, thank you guys.